Welcome to DMthePM Unlock Product Concepts podcast, where we cut through the noise of product jargon to deliver actionable step-by-step insights from industry practitioners, helping founders and product leaders turn complex concepts into clear, practical strategies they can apply today. I'm Diana, your podcast host. I'm a product coach and consultant. I work with startups and mid-sized tech companies, and I help them build impactful products in weeks, not months. I help drive business growth by creating an efficient product development process, validating ideas early, and establishing effective customer feedback loops. So, what prompted today's discussion? So, we know the world is changing at a faster pace now than ever, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. And that leaves a lot of companies with a lot of choices and really high ambiguity. Now, innovation, so I think, is no longer a choice. It has become a key part of a company's operations because the cost of not innovating is definitely way too high. And we know that as product managers is our responsibility to drive the business forward and to deliver results. But innovation is a lot more than that. It's a lot more than just a product development process. And it's exactly what we'll cover in today's podcast. What does innovation actually look like? And we will hear from Jeremy Shute, Fortune 500 leader who has been driving this type of change over the last 25 years in companies like Johnson Johnson, Johnson and McCormick, and is now a co-founder of Ignition Strategy, a consultancy that helps companies extract 25 to 35% more value from the capabilities they already have. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure. I wanted to start with, can you tell me a bit about your experience with innovation?
Yeah, well, firstly, Diana, thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast and hopefully to share a few learnings that some of your listeners will appreciate. As you say, 25, actually, I think it may be even 35 years across companies like Johnson Johnson, which is a Fortune 50 company, as you said, McCormick, which is a Fortune 500 company, and Johnson, which is one of America's largest family-owned companies, and still family-owned. So across those 35 or so years, I've had responsibilities for innovation in all of the roles, both at a local level to start with, that was in the UK, then at a regional level, so responsible for driving innovation across multiple markets within a region, and then finally globally. So in the last role, I headed up global innovation. This has been across the world. Actually, when I think about it, I've run either consumer groups or been into consumers' homes in places like Japan, which was fantastic and amazingly different, to India, to China, to Russia, to Mexico, to the US, to Australia, and then all over Europe across the time. And it's obviously changed quite considerably from what used to happen when it was quite mechanical, quite slow. Everybody wanted to be quicker. Now there's tools and technologies that facilitate that. But innovation's been a part of my career for all of that time. And then more latterly, we extended away from traditional innovation to set up a disruptive innovation group at my previous organization to try and anticipate somebody coming in and disrupting our core business by doing it ourselves, which is another approach. But these have all been fascinating, and you're absolutely right. Innovation is at the core of the growth of all of those companies that I've mentioned. In fact, the previous one had an algorithm for growth of a third core, a third M&A, and a third innovation. And that's typically how they measured it, so that they would look at where the growth was coming from. And it was expected from the teams that worked on innovation that a third of that growth would come through products that didn't exist today. And those products, by the way, could be something completely different. It could be an extension of what you've already got, or it could just be filling in gaps or continually improving, because all of the above are innovation in some shape or form. I think people tend to assume innovation's, big, new, dramatic, game-changing, blue sky ideas, but they're not. They can be anything as simple as just changing packaging to make it easy to open or to close, for that matter. So yeah, innovation's been an important part of my life, and actually also one of the more fun elements of the roles that I've had, because it's all new. You're learning so much, and you deal with consumers every day when you're doing it.
Wow, that's really interesting. I can't believe there's like a so for that growth calculate like
The
the
algorithm, yeah.
algorithm to predict it. Um, how what was the time period?
So that was looking every year as you look at where your
Okay.
growth is coming from. I mean, typically a metric would be the percentage of products launched from MPD in the last 3 years as a percentage of the total revenue. That was typically the metric. And we would always try and get, depending on which company, over 10% or 15%. That's a typical metric. So we overlaid that with whether a third of the total growth, which was the company algorithm, was coming from new products.
I've worked more like scale ups, so maybe like slightly less established over time. But it's really interesting. A lot of time you launch new things, and do you actually track over 3 years the impact it's been having? Because experimentation is so common that you think, oh yeah, this is going to lead to 20% increase, but it doesn't, because overall in the year, or when you look at how that product was being used over 3 years, it's
Yeah.
probably 2%.
Yes.
And I remember the calculation was quite hard to get your head around of what is the bottom line.
Yeah, and that assumes that growth's coming from it. What it doesn't measure is products that have exited, because many products will be
Mm.
discontinued. And you've got a net one off against the other, because there isn't an infinite amount of shelf space, for example, because all of the companies that I mentioned I work for, uh, their traditional distribution channel is through a supermarket or a retailer. So there's only a finite amount of shelf, and quite candidly, that's getting more and more challenging. And I know there's online now where you can launch things, so you have to net off what you're launching, because it's not just about adding, with what you're discontinuing. And you always had to make the calculation that the one that you were replacing, you were going to deliver more than that was generating, which was pretty important. I think the other thing on metrics to look at is there's a very high percentage of new product that doesn't work. Anything up to 95%, depending on what source you look at. But you've got to make sure that you're launching things that are sustainable, and there are certain things that have to be in place for that to happen. Not least of which, you have to understand the consumer and the pain points that they have, because if you don't, then sooner or later it's not going to work. But
Mm.
whilst I think the traditional measures are all about revenue generated, I think it's also healthy to look at whatever size you are, whatever you're doing in innovation, whatever you're improving, that it's sustainable, because there's a lot of effort, sometimes to generate something that is £10,000 worth of revenue. It's often the same amount of resource, of R&D, of supply chain, and so on, than if it's £1 million or $1 million. So you've got to be quite careful that you're not spending lots of resource for something that isn't going to be around in a year or 2 years' time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think with physical products, it's good that you have that image in your head of there's X amount of shelf space. I think that's probably a lot of good digital products do now, of we should only get people to take two actions or something in a journey, rather than bombarding them with a lot of different features and a lot of different ways in which you can go. So yeah, I think removing stuff is probably, well, it's definitely as important as adding. And you mentioned, is there like a framework or like a set of principles you use when thinking about driving innovation, as you said, inside a company?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing is that the company, I think, has to be supportive of innovation, and that starts where it's worked the best. It starts with the senior leadership team. I've never worked in an organization where innovation has been incredibly successful, where the senior leadership team hasn't pushed it. Because if you think about it, there are lots of
Mm.
competing resources for the core business, for new products, for M&A, mergers and acquisitions, lots of other things going on. And one of the things that we did when we were planning long term, so either 3 or 5 years ahead, was to make sure that we audited the senior leadership team for where innovation fitted in their priority list. And when you force somebody to say, well, look, of all of these things, how would you rank innovation? Or sometimes we used, you have 100% of discretionary effort. you've got 5 things you can spend your time on, or the company's time on, because they're allocating resources, and you get a sense for where innovation fits. It's always more successful when the senior leadership are behind it. Elon Musk's been in the news a lot recently for various things, but he pushed, electric car through Tesla. And it's just great to have a senior leader in an organization who's driving that agenda, number one. Number two, putting the consumer at the heart is obviously, it's a bit of a cliche, and it's stating the obvious on innovation. But it's amazing how many times over those 35 years, I've seen somebody in the organization come up with a great idea, sometimes from research and development or a technical solution. And then we all run around trying to find a problem to back it into, to justify it. And it might be a good idea, but it might not have been anchored in what the consumer wants. So it's always good, in my experience, to start with consumers and pain points and what exactly are they looking for? Because ultimately they're the ones who are going to make your innovation successful. If they don't buy it, then it won't be successful, which is, I think, part of the reason. I know it's a well-trodden story, but within Amazon, they have an empty chair in their meetings for the customer, so that they remind themselves as they're having the conversations who's in that chair and what are they looking for. And way back when, Sam Walton, who set up Walmart, many years ago, would talk about the only person in the organization who can fire anybody is the customer by taking their value, their money elsewhere and spending it on a competitor product. So I think successful organizations like a Walmart, like an Amazon, never stop putting the consumer at the heart or the customer at the heart of what they do. And again, I've never worked in an innovation team that's been successful that hasn't had a good handle on what the consumer really values from a product. And one more build on that. If you're asking a consumer to change a habit, it's one of the most difficult things to do in marketing generally, and especially in innovation. If you're asking them to add a step to their process or to do something different, then just recognize that it's time consuming and sometimes expensive to communicate that they need to do something other than what they've been used to doing. Because we're all very habitual as humans. To build on an existing habit and innovate around that, much easier and much more successful.
Really interesting. No, I completely resonate. I wanted to so when I was working at Tesco, and it was I started in 2014, so that was when the whole turnaround of the business started with Dave Lewis coming in. There was a big rebrand in terms of who's our customer, and they did such a good job of making it very visible. So one of the things we had is everywhere we had pictures of customers, literally in the canteen. You'll be able to see the people that you're serving on a day-to-day basis. And I think it helped because that was just a constant reminder, even if you didn't realize that actually you should really consider your customers. And another company that I work for that was really good, Gusto, was they had names, they had the personas of the customers, so you could always reference them back. So I think definitely there's that understanding of or definition around it. I think a lot of times if you're leaving it too vague, then it's ineffective. So it has to be specific, but not too specific. That one is quite hard to get right, but I think it's worth companies investing in getting it right.
No, absolutely. And Dave Lewis at Tesco, I think he came from Unilever. Certainly came from a consumer good background. I met him actually a couple of times. I was on a health and wellness steerco on the Consumer Good Forum, and he was representing Tesco, and talked a lot about consumers and said whatever problems Tesco have, the answer's going to lie somewhere in the consumer. Yeah, no question. And the use of personas is, again, something that we've done a lot of. And I remember going into markets where, I referenced Japan and China and Mexico. And whilst consumers are different, and their habits and their practices and rituals, what they're all looking for are solutions to what is relevant and meaningful to them. So there are times when you go into a home like Japan, which is so totally unique. And again, I was working for Johnson, so we're working in household cleaning. So we go in the kitchen and we look around, and one of the ladies was referring to a a dishwasher that she had problems with cleaning. And I was looking around and thought, well, I can't see this dishwasher. I wonder if it's somewhere else. But the homes in Japan are so small that there is nowhere else. This kitchen was it. And she kept pointing to this microwave on top of a cabinet. And I looked and said to the translator, but where's the dishwasher? And she pointed again at this microwave. And I said, but that's a microwave. And she said, no, it's a dishwasher. So in Japan, they don't have space. So the dishwasher is just a tiny, it looked like a microwave, but she opened the front and then you could fit a couple of plates and a couple of cups and a knife and fork in there. And that was it. But that's all they had. So you realize that, the habits and the practices are somewhat different. The environment that they operate in is different. But if you understand that, even things like storage, if you're developing household cleaning utensils, they have nowhere to store. So actually, she pulled up from under a rug on the kitchen floor a trap door, and there was a small storage space for brooms and dustpans and brush and some cleaning fluid, stuff like that. But it made you think that she has no space. So anything we sell in Japan has to be able to fit in this small space. I never would have known that if I hadn't been in there. And India and China, equally different, but all in unique ways. So, if you go and spend your time, Russia clearly is more difficult to go into now. But I spent a lot of time in Russia, a lot of times in consumers' homes, and it's quite astonishing when you go up into what we would call tower blocks. Now they're called sleeping houses, which are the big tower blocks outside of the suburbs of Moscow or St. Petersburg. They were incredibly warm because they were heated by the state. And, you'd go into bathrooms to look for SC Johnson for cleaning fluid, and there will be cockroaches under, lots of them, not one or two, underneath the basins. But again, you realize that there's an opportunity here. SC Johnson produce pesticide products, insect repellents and the like. There's an opportunity beyond just the cleaning, but also, and again, not something we would have known if we hadn't got in there. So I think understanding the consumer in as much depth as you can do, and now it's a lot easier. A lot of it is online. It can be done very quickly. It's all automated. AI can generate responses and group them and theme them. But I must say, from time to time, going old school and actually going out and sitting with a consumer, listening to them, and seeing how they use your product or service, I still don't think there's any substitute for that.
I agree. I've mainly worked for digital products, but again, kind of referencing back to Gusto, they did diaries. So Gusto was like food delivery like box, and they had to understand what are the patterns and the habits because it was a new habit. So you had to be like, okay, well, you're now changing. So you're transitioning from, you buying all the ingredients to this box being delivered with everything. So how does that work in your kitchen? How does, what is the process for it? So I thought that was really good. We didn't really get to go in people's house. And I think this is it because as a product manager, you get split based on the user journey. So you're like, okay, you're acquisition, you're now retention, you're now menu. So you got split out to deliver on a very specific problem. But the whole thing, if everyone should understand how does this whole thing fit into someone's decision making, into their lifestyle on a day-to-day basis. But obviously it's quite costly to do that type of research and you need to have a team. But yeah, I don't know if you have alternatives, so other ways in which people could do that type of research without it being too expensive.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think online now gives you access to more consumers because you're right, back in the day, to set up consumer groups in people's homes or to go visit people's homes, especially if you're working internationally, is expensive. You can do a lot of that online. You can see them using product online. We've done that. AI can consolidate a lot of the conversation and then build out themes. So you can capture insights a lot better and a lot faster. And you're right, you segmented between, retention and acquisition and so on. I think the other thing that's really important is ideas for new products, to the extent that everybody in the organization can start to understand that the consumer's at the center and they can understand what the pain points are. You'd be amazed how much leverage of ideas that there can be internally. It never ceases to amaze me how little organizations use of that. And when I say internally, I mean inside the organization, but also the associated partnerships like agencies outside. So it could be somebody who's been at the organization 35 years who almost gets forgotten now because, Peter's been there a long time, so nobody involves him anymore. But he's an encyclopedia of knowledge of what's worked in the past and what we've done and what's been great and what hasn't. You can also look back at what you've tested in the past. My business partner and I, we both work for competing companies. I worked for SC Johnson, he worked for Reckitt. He worked on Airwick, I worked on Glade at SC Johnson, and we were looking at new fragrances. And we both tested chocolate around 2000, 2001. And at the time, every consumer said, well, that's horrible. We don't want the house smelling of chocolate. But now if you look at fragrances and even fine fragrances, you'll see hints of chocolate. It's a much more sophisticated use of that ingredient now than it was never considered then. Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream company, they have a graveyard of older flavors in the US. And I think you can go and visit as a consumer. You can go and have a look at this graveyard and you see headstones for the old flavors that you might have bought in the past. And they resurrect them every now and then for a special event like Halloween. So as you look through the organization, and I would include suppliers in that, we were looking at trying to enhance freshness of a particular product. And there were ideas internally, but one of the suppliers, this product was distributed in a glass bottle, said, well, what we could do is just add a tint of green and it would just bring out the green of the actual product and look fresher. So we just mocked it up, and no additional cost to this, but it looked fantastic when you compared one against the other. But such a simple idea that nobody would have thought of in the branded team, but involving the suppliers or the agencies, or often the customer. Sometimes you're competing in consumer good organizations against the customer because private label's quite big, but that can also spawn ideas that you otherwise wouldn't have had. So I think the importance of everybody in the organization being involved in innovation, and that broad definition of innovation. So not always just product, but just doing things better. It could be customer service, how to connect with your consumers if somebody calls in. Or it could be how to deal with a problem that a customer's got. So many simple solutions have come from just an idea that somebody's got internally, that you think, wow, and so few organizations capture that, because we've all got more capability at our fingertips from, even if I look at something like an iPhone, you and I'll have 80, 90 apps on the iPhone, but we'll only use about 10 on a regular basis. But all the others can add value to something or other, but we tend not to because we're busy, we get into habits. When we've got busy lives, we try and reduce the complexity by eliminating things. It's a bit like that in an organization. When everybody's busy, everybody is in a habit, it was the way we've always done it. You tend to overlook things that are literally at your fingertips. And innovation's no different. There will be so many ideas, and anybody listening to this, I promise you will have a lot more at your fingertips than you are using. And I'm going to hazard a guess, 70% of what you could get access to is sitting there, not being used, and you'll generate great ideas. So that's something to think about when you're assigning responsibility for innovation. Back in the day, people used to say, well, John or Janet, they're responsible for innovation, let them get on with it. But actually, both of them will benefit from having the whole organization support and an idea generation. Maybe a couple of other things, because this could be applicable to smaller organizations as well. One of the things we used to do was we partnered with a small company who did sort of psychometric testing to identify really creative people. And I'm sure there are tests for this still now. And we went through the organization and we identified about a dozen people who were exceptionally creative. You wouldn't have known it, but when we put them into groups to generate, ideas, they just had very different ways of thinking. And it's good to get diversity in innovation as well, because there's lots of different perspectives then come into play, and we'll give you a different angle on innovation. But we sometimes put them against tough problems because we knew that they were more creative, and identifying them was super useful.
And this is a really, really good point. So you mentioned about, why if all of this is accessible to companies, and they're overlooking, the people they have, or the ideas they already have. And it kind of makes sense, because that applies to any size company. Even if you just started out 5 years or 2 years, you kind of get stuck into your habits. You get stuck into, okay, we have to generally deliver more. That's the main thing. It's like, we need to just do things faster and better and more of them. But it's interesting, because I think that's when people kind of get stuck into their roles of, I'm an engineer, I'm just going to deliver this, or I'm in marketing, I'm going to do this. Are there any structures or any ways to bring these people together, or to facilitate the fact that, look, anyone can contribute to this? Because sometimes people don't know they can contribute, or they contribute in the past and they've been shut down, or people, a lot of companies do hackathons, and the hackathons lead to nothing, in terms of, it was nice 2 days, and then the ideas just disappear. So how do you actually create that space?
Well, the old adage is, if you want to get a good idea, you've got to get a lot of ideas. So you've got to generate lots, and it's impossible if you're just using the people who are designated to drive innovation. It's not enough. And that's both internal and external. So I think, first of all, you have to make people aware that, and develop a culture of innovation, that innovation is everybody's responsibility. It was a catchphrase. She's a little bit cliched these days, but we used probably 20 years ago, when I was at a previous organization. So we made everybody aware. We encouraged people to allocate a percentage of their time to think about, from their perspective, because again, everybody has different vantage points. Even if they think, well, innovation is surely not me. Yes, it could be. But again, this is within a framework of, these are the pain points around consumers. So you don't let people have completely free rein to generate ideas that might be of no value to the consumer. So give them a framework of, maybe these three areas. We want it to be more convenient, we want it to be fresher, we want it to be faster, whatever it is for the consumer. And if people have got those spaces to think about innovation, there are companies like Google, where they have 20% of their time thought about ideas, but it's formalized, so people don't feel uncomfortable generating ideas where somebody says, well, what are you doing that for? You should be doing your day job. It's a healthy thing, but you've got to be deliberate. You've got to create a culture where that is encouraged, it's recognized, and it's almost rewarded. If you think about organizations where they've been very innovative, 3M, for example, Post-it notes came from actually somebody who developed the idea of a Post-it note to bookmark his hymn book in church. And that's how Post-it notes came about. They thought, well, this is a great idea. What if we put them all together in a pad? Or Starbucks Frappuccino, a store manager saw how blended beverages in a Californian store were starting to become popular, and mentioned that back to the innovation group. And so all of these things, but they have to almost be, encouraged. And the Happy Meal concept at McDonald's came from a franchise who noticed that parents used to come in and ask for different meals for children, and said, well, why don't we have a smaller Happy Meal version, and then start to provide sort of toys and so on. It wasn't formally asked for it, but he saw the idea, let the parent company know, and that's how the Happy Meals came about. You'd be amazed at some of the innovation stories where they've originated from. And if you really didn't encourage it, there was a Swiss engineer out walking his dog, Frederick Menstral, I think his name was, and he noticed that from the thistles, the burrs got caught on the dog's fur. And he noticed when he was pulling them off that they had little hooks on them to attach themselves to the dog's fur. And that spawned the idea of Velcro, that he went back to the lab, and then 2 years later they were commercializing this product. But that's almost accidental. But again, if you're not encouraging somebody to come back with those ideas, and everybody's got them in the organization, I guarantee if you've got an organization today, no matter how small, even if you're a startup, where you've just got somebody who's responsible for it, you're not going to reach your full potential if you don't set the conditions, provide the kind of areas where consumer pain points are, and encourage people. And then once they start generating ideas, is really helpful if you've got the senior leadership to buy into that. So sometimes they come along, they sponsor it, they make a few words if you're presenting it, they acknowledge people's great ideas and recognize it. Because often people were thinking, well, what do the senior leadership team think? If I'm generating ideas, are they going to be worried I'm not doing my day job? So all of those things I think are helpful. But so many of the most successful and innovative organizations encourage it and spend time
Nurturing it.
facilitating it internally.
Yeah, and I think this is it, because a lot of ideas, best ideas, don't necessarily come from you sitting at your desk and doing whatever you're doing, because again, you're stuck in your habit, is actually getting out of that. And but I think you definitely covered it so well in terms of you need to give people the guardrails of here's the strategy, here's what who we're serving in terms of our customers, and then be like, great, now go off and think about it, because I think the limitations actually encourage more creativity. Anyway, if you ask anyone, they will tell you innovation is something I really want to do, or we're doing, or whatever it is, but it doesn't really happen. Why? Like, what do people get wrong about innovation?
Well, you've always got to balance for companies that have got an established set of products or services. That's their core. And there's the perennial conversation internally, and I've seen it throughout those 35 years of do we do more of the core or do we innovate? And innovation's got an inherent risk, whereas the core hasn't. The core is established. You've got your base of consumers and you've got loyal consumers, and you keep that ticking over. And especially if you're doing well, there's even less appetite to take a risk to launch something that potentially may or may not work. And remember, you've got a finite amount of resource to spend behind your brands. So there's always that question behind the base business, the core business, and innovation. So I think you have to factor that in. But I think it was Steve Jobs who said something along the lines of "You've got to innovate or die." And I had a previous boss who said there are two types of companies: those that innovate and those that die. So two similar themes that if you don't, even if you are successful, sooner or later, remember that spectrum of innovation from blue sky to just continuous improvement. One's big game changing, needs communication and sometimes changing habits. The other one is just continuous improvement of, making a bit of packaging better. If you are the brand leader and you are going to retain the consumers you've got and encourage more consumers to come on and join, you need to be doing both. You need to reset the market occasionally and bring in new innovations. Otherwise, somebody else will do it, and you'll get disintermediated, and somebody else will join you. And there's some classic examples of that. Blockbuster Video were approached many years ago by Netflix for $50 million, and they turned them down and said, well, why would we be interested in that? We've got all of these stores. Or Kodak invented a digital camera, and they had 90% of the world's film market. So why did they have to change? And they didn't change in both of those instances. And there are many others also. But that's the time to consider the change. It's part of the reason we set up the disruptive innovation, because once you start to do that, you can start to get a sense for how other people might disrupt your own business model. And then you can choose to do it or not to do it. But in the case of Blockbuster Video and Kodak, both of them could have made that change, and they would have been successful. Kodak could have redefined themselves as an imaging company instead of a film company. And imaging can move into, to movies, into medical devices, just as Fuji did, for example, was also a film company at the time. But they chose to be very one-dimensional. So sometimes organizations don't, because they don't have to. There isn't the burning kind of platform, but then somebody can come in and just, as I say, disintermediate them. So I think that's part of the reason that they're trying to balance more of what they've already got and been successful, and the risk that innovation inherently applies. But that's why I say the senior leadership team need to be on board and have already placed strategic importance to innovation, and recognizing that refreshing what you've already got not only keeps existing consumers happy, but stops somebody else coming in and taking them with sometimes it can be something quite small, or it can be something that's sort of on trend, because today your ability to market to a broader audience or niches in the audience is much different to, when I first started, where there were traditional channels where you reached everybody, in an evening, and that wasn't that long ago. Now you can get influencers or bloggers or something making a big difference, and a brand suddenly becomes very topical, and that can happen overnight. So that to me is also innovation. It doesn't just have to be on a product or service. It can be in the way that you communicate to consumers. So you need to be thinking in the organization about all of the potential touch points, as well as what your product or service delivers. But if you don't, because there's a risk attached to it, then you do run the risk of becoming very quickly irrelevant to either all your consumer base or at least a proportion of them, and especially younger consumers. If you're a brand that typically services an older profile of consumer, sooner or later you're going to have to attract youngsters, and you need to be thinking about that now, not waiting until it's absolutely the last minute. So I think that's part of the reason why it's always a difficult conversation. You've got a limited amount of money, you've got to spend it wisely. That's why we would always start with the senior leadership team and try and establish where innovation sits in their priority list. Because if it isn't high, it's difficult to do all the things you're gonna need. You might get one year where somebody decides, yes, well, let's spend something on innovation. You launch something, you advertise it, and then the next year they say, oh, we need to do something on the core, and then you pull that. The amount of times we used to call it love it and leave it. You'd launch it, everybody would love it when it was launching, and then a year later you pull the plug. And the retailers would give you a certain amount of time back in the day. Now less and less time. I think they've got algorithms and AI dictating what's working on their limited shelf space. So you get less time to prove yourself. So if you're not continually bringing new consumers in and growing the market because somebody's pulled the support, then very quickly that new product will be consigned into the kind of failure bucket. And the other thing that does is it gets everybody more worried and more risk adverse within the organization, because they look to what didn't work last year, regardless of the reasons. I always tend to look at innovation in three ways. One is ideation, so generating the ideas, doing all the things that we talked about earlier, developing the product so that the product or service matches what the consumer is looking for, because you can have a great idea and not deliver something that matches that. And then how you execute it. So whether it's online or whether it's on the fixture, how you actually deliver that to the consumer in a way that they understand what it is, that they are aware of it, that they're interested in it, and ultimately that they purchase it. You can have a fantastic idea. And we used to have an adage in consumer goods where we had to go through the supermarkets. I mean, now you can go online, that we wouldn't launch something with advertising unless it had at least 65% distribution. That was essentially a fix, and that was probably when I was starting 30 years ago. But again, you should have certain criteria that if you're going to launch something successfully and you're going to heavily support it, the consumer who is seeing this support material should have the ability to buy it. And I'm stating the obvious there, but the amount of times you poorly execute something because it hasn't got the distribution either online or in the physical retail environment, it's not going to work. And everybody will get discouraged, and then people will start pulling back from innovation, saying, well, it didn't work, let's not make that mistake again, which does lead me to one other thing. It used to be called postmortems back in the day, but it's just learning from what you've done to make sure that in the future, anything that could have been done better, you think about doing, and you don't make the same mistake twice. So these are things that I think, no matter what size an organization, when you've done something, you try and document the learning so that everybody, especially if people leave, if somebody who was responsible for innovation leaves, they take all the insights with them. Try and document and have a more systematic approach to insights and learning. That's super important.
Completely. There's so many brilliant points in that. I think one of the, with innovation, there's so many different things that can go wrong. I think obviously if you're doing continuous improvement, then you can see how it's working. Like, the feedback loop is a lot quicker. But for something like launching new things, I completely agree that you want to have the backing. I think every time we launched new features, obviously MVPs are such a big thing, but adoption is such an important part of it. Have you actually done the work to explain to the customer around why would they try this? What is the value they're going to get, and kind of wait around. I think they were saying that, I think Wikipedia was it, or some, even Slack, when companies do like a relaunch of their interface, they're saying people are going to hate it for X amount of time because you're pushing them into a new habit, into a new pattern. But that doesn't mean that your design is bad. Because if you were to launch it and say, what's the feedback? Oh, it's all negative. No one can find anything. Let's just, that's it. It didn't work. But actually, you have to wait X amount of time. So I think the rules are slightly different for maybe not like launching new products and disruptive innovation.
Yeah, well, every company started small. Everybody started with an idea, no matter how big they are now. I mean, if you look at companies like Monzo, the bank, they started, I think, with a prepaid card and an app, and they gathered on a very small basis your MVP. What we call speed steps in our business. Deliveroo, they piloted originally with a group of restaurants to see how it worked. Revolut, which is the bank that we use in our company, they started on currency exchange to see if they could do that well. And they found what worked and what didn't really quickly and really inexpensively. And, you asked earlier on about, how you can do that without too much expense. You find the consumers you're targeting and get them to use it, an MVP. And you'll learn lots. Now, all of those companies are successful, and they've been successful quite quickly, but they've lent in a bit, they've tried something, they've seen what works and what hasn't, and then they've started to scale it up. And it's easy to say that. But again, if you've got a systematic process and you start to identify what works, what doesn't, what resonates with consumers, because all of those brands are disrupting an existing market. And actually, it's a case of Deliveroo, you're asking somebody to change habit. People go out and get a takeaway, and now suddenly it's delivered. My daughter would never consider going out to get a takeaway, whereas I do. I like to know I'm going out to get it, whereas Deliveroo's constantly arriving at our door. But originally, that was a concept that they built out through just some very small scale work, understood what resonated with which consumer, what worked, what didn't. And now all of these are incredibly successful. Even sometimes things you think, well, that surely isn't going to work, but it does. I still struggle with the concept of shipping things to home, like Boohoo, for example, to try, and then shipping them back if they don't fit. For me, I'm of the vintage where you go in and you try something, and then if it fits, it's going to fit, and you bring it back. But consumer habits, and that is a different habit. So, that's taken a while to get used to. But I see young people, as evidenced by both my daughters, for them, that's normal. It's perfectly normal, and it's just part of the process of buying, clothing. Whereas previously that wouldn't have happened. So, but those are the insights that were generated. They probably did that small scale. They tested it. They found an operating model that worked for them. And they would have had lots of support of recognizing that this is what younger consumers were looking for. And lo and behold, with a bit of patience, which also is the case, you can easily back off of innovation if it isn't working immediately, because you start to compare it against your core if you're in a certain industry, and people in the organization might get a little reticent and a little bit concerned and say, well, let's not spend any more money on this, when sometimes, especially if you're changing habits, that's what happens. It takes a while.
And I'll ask kind of the last question, which is, how do you effectively measure innovation? Because like exactly what we're saying is like, you don't really, like, the parameters are slightly different from your core. Yeah, how do you know?
Yeah, well, what we said at the beginning was that you can spend your money in different ways, as an organization, or as we often call it, discretionary effort. You can put effort behind different things in the organization. So you've got to measure what's working, what hasn't, against your overall goals. So I would call those key performance indicators. So, think about a dashboard on a car. You don't have that many things that you're measuring, and that's important in innovation, because otherwise you'll get distracted. But leading indicators, so the things that sit below those, you have to make sure that the products are sustainable. Also, profitability is a really important point that we haven't mentioned yet. But again, if you're launching things that are diluting the overall margin of the business. If you're replacing something with something else, might have a higher velocity, but it's a much lower margin. You need to be aware of that. And obviously regularly feedback, sometimes companies will test something to validate that the concept's going to work, and then the product delivers against the concept. But often once it gets launched, they don't then track, is it actually delivering in the real world? Of course, market share will give you some indication of that, but you can still talk to consumers about their experience 6 months in, which we used to do, to see if there are things that we might need to change. There's always something that you haven't anticipated that can be tweaked. So I think whatever the metrics you use, I always would counsel people to try and think about some key performance indicators. So the big things that are going to be important. So the revenue, the margins, consumer satisfaction, and then maybe leading indicators that sit below that give you an indication of the metrics that build up to those key performance indicators, and then regularly check them. And all the best companies are all continuous and relentless in improving not only what they've already got, but making sure that any innovation is going to reflect what ultimately the consumer's going to buy. So I think you've got to set at the beginning the objective of what are you trying to do with the innovation, and the metric is an output of your objective. If you're trying to attract new users, then measure that. If you're trying to make existing consumers happy, measure that. If you're trying to improve the overall margin of a particular segment, then measure that. But have a clear idea of what you're doing. As an old boss of mine would say, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Metrics are just simply a way of tracking the progress of the choices that you've made. And if you think about it like that, you won't go too far wrong, because you'll only measure things that you really care about the answer to, because that's a choice you made of the limited amount of resources you've got at your disposal to deploy in the organization. So if you're putting it all over there, then measure it, decide what you're trying to do, and make sure the metric fits that.
Yeah, that comes back to the whole leadership buy-in, leadership investing or deciding to invest on a limited amount of things. But I've definitely seen where leadership wants everything. And then there's the whole bottom up of let's innovate from within. And then the top is, I just want all these things done without aligning to a strategy. We just rely on some metrics because we want everything. You want acquisition, you want retention, you want all of it. And then it ends up with like 50 things that all these 50 people in a company have to do. And it's like, that's when it's very hard. But I think that's the story that's a lot more common.
And I totally get it that the senior leaders want everything, and they set the agenda because everybody's looking to see what the boss wants. So it is important to get them on board with innovation. It's just more difficult to get the rest of the organization. We haven't talked about the importance of not just generating ideas from the whole organization, but everybody working together. Because if you think about launching a new product, if your consumer product with a physical item, it's not just marketing, it's not just market research with the consumer, it's not sales to get it into the customer, but it's supply chain to make it and logistics to distribute it. It's R&D to help support it. Everybody needs to be working collaboratively together. And if they all know it's important, then they're going to assign the best people, enough of them, to make it happen. So that's why I think it's difficult, no matter how small you are, that innovation's almost got to be set as a strategic priority. You can get around it, but it's so much more difficult if it isn't. Look at Amazon. They won't have done everything perfectly. I remember the experience back 25 years ago to now. It's totally different. But they're always looking at ways to improve, small things that the consumer wants, like, if something comes and it's not perfect, how to send it back. It used to be difficult. Now it's much easier. Well, I'd say it's just now easy, and it's part of the process. So there's always things that can be improved. But that's innovation. All of the companies who are successful, be they Microsoft, Google, Amazon, or McDonald's, or Walmart, for all of the big changes they make hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller changes that the consumer will notice every day. This notion of continuous improvement of 1% of something, and when you put it all back together again, it makes up 10-15% that everybody will notice in their experience. So that's why having a company where it's been identified as an important area, innovation is just so important, and that can really only come from the senior leader. And you still have the challenge that you laid out, that there will be some people that want everything, but that's part of strategy. To me, is a choiceful allocation of resources. You've got 100% you can use. Again, an old boss of mine used to say, I've got a duvet, I can cover the feet, but not the head, or the head, but not the feet. I can't cover the feet and the head. So you have to make a choice. And then you measure the choice that you've made and just check. And that's part of the education for senior leaders to recognize that the organization, it's better to be really good at a few things than average or bad at many things. And that's sometimes the failure of innovation when you try and do too much. Pick the things that consumers or customers really care about, and then really do those well. And over time, you'll get rewarded for that. And the metrics that we talked about, well, that's just tracking progress. It's giving you a sense for, are you delivering what you said you would do? But it's not complicated. Innovation, I'm not saying it's easy. Of course, it isn't easy, and it takes a lot of effort to get it right. But it can be made to look more complicated than it is. I think if you put certain principles and frameworks in place, you just give yourself a better chance in what's always going to be a slightly difficult area, because getting consumers to accept something new has an inherent risk. But if it's better, and they clearly understand why it's better than whatever they were using or adopting before, you're going to be on the way to a successful business. I've seen that so many times not to question it anymore.
Yeah, I think this is like, it's more around getting the right structures in place and having a. I think innovation, to be fair, is more of a culture. I think we're at the end of this. I really enjoyed it. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before I close off?
No, well, firstly, thank you for inviting me. I mean, I really enjoyed talking about innovation, and it's brought back many happy memories for me, because I've been working in the space for 35 years or so, and you don't realize how long it's been until you start reminiscing about things you did. The whole space has changed. There's still a degree of risk, but now there's a lot more opportunity. There's technology, there's online, there's AI, and it's changing the nature of the relationship with the consumer, which is at the base and the core of innovation. Because if you've got a good understanding of the consumer, as we said at the beginning, but even though it has changed significantly, I think it's opened up more opportunities. There are way more smaller companies who are now disrupting around the edges some of the bigger brands, and if they're consumer brands, sooner or later they're going to try and get a listing at a retailer to build scale, because online businesses are notoriously difficult to scale up and get a good size. But even in the time that I was at my previous company, McCormick, which is a herb and spice company, among other things, in that 12 years, there were 100 online herb and spice companies that were started up during the time that I was there. And some of them have been acquired already by companies like Kraft Heinz and Nestle. And you realize very quickly that it's much easier now to set up, to find a niche. It's more difficult to scale. Well, certainly it's as difficult as it ever was. But the ability to get going with an idea is, I think, potentially easier now than it used to be. And I think AI will take it in a totally different direction. So no, really enjoyed having the conversation with you and sharing a few hopefully useful insights for people, and also bringing back lots of memories for me, all of which are positive. And, I can't imagine having had the career that I've had, innovation not being as an important part of it as it was. That it would never have been as good. So thanks for inviting me and spending the time with me today.
No, thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's been brilliant, and sharing all your and hearing all your different stories. So thank you so much.